Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. How you feeling? Thank you. Yeah. As my 15-year-old son Sam would say, let's go, baby. But let's wait for a minute and check that our panel members are okay before we do go. How are we doing, panel members? Yeah, we're ready? Got drinks? Yeah. John, have you got a drink? Not yet. Would you like one? All right, back to Sam. Let's go, baby. Let's do this. Please, everybody, welcome Elisa de Ranieri from Springer Nature, Diego Baptista from Wellcome Trust, and John Inglis from Cold Spring Harbor Labs. These are our panel members for today, and my name is Chris Graf. I work at Wiley, and by way of disclosure, I'm the co-chair of an organization called COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. And today, we're going to spend some time thinking about the new ways that we have of sharing research, of evolutions in peer-reviewed publishing. But as well as that, we're going to talk about how we maintain two, what I would say, are totally essential aspects of the qualities of the research that we publish. Namely, the clicker works, that's great, integrity and ethics. And by integrity, what we mean is, does the research that we've published stand up to scrutiny? That might overlap into other words like reliability, like reproducibility, like trustworthiness. It might involve things like data that we've just been talking about. And ethics, well, that's all the other stuff, the treatment of the humans, the people, and the animals that might be part of a research endeavor. Might be the legal responsibilities there, the legal requirements, including for things like trial registration. And it might be the sort of community-led obligations for ethical behaviors in how you treat your other researchers as authors, as co-authors, as how you cite other people's work, and so on. But before we get all sort of glum and serious about all of this, are there any music lovers in the house? Put your hand up. Who likes music? It's not a trick question, by the way. So that's only about half of us, right? That's a crescendo going from pianissimo on one side to fortissimo on the other side. Okay, music lovers, please put your hands back up. Are there any pizza lovers in the house? Put your hands up. Right, that'll get into about half of the audience. So half of us like music and pizza. Right, everyone keep your hands up, right? And what about ice cream? Everyone else who likes ice cream, put their hands up. Right, who didn't put their hand up? I'm not going to name and shame you, but there are people in the audience who are neither music lovers, pizza lovers, or ice cream lovers. That's a bit shocking, really. So what does this picture remind you of? Anything? A crescendo, a piece of pizza, ice cream. It's also a figure from a paper. It's the growth of retractions over, a 10-year, bit more period. And I do hope, like we're all pizza lovers and music lovers and ice cream lovers, that we're also retraction lovers, because I think retractions are a sign of quality. They're a sign of our commitment to curating the research that we publish properly. This figure comes from a study published in 2018, October, of 10,000 retractions from the world's largest database of retractions called retractiondatabase.org by a gentleman called Jeffrey Brainard, a journalist who works at Science magazine. And you'll see on the far left that in about 2000 there were 100 retractions a year, and that grew by a factor of 10 by the time we get to about 2014. Now, don't be shocked by that. There's a baseline growth in journal articles over the same sort of period. Journal articles published have doubled over that period. And of the total number, about 4 in 10,000 articles are retracted, so it's a very small proportion. To explain the figure a bit more, the blue sort of waves are representing the 40% or so of retractions that represent mistakes or honest errors, so people doing a good job of tidying up when they spot that something's wrong. The orange parts of the wave are retractions for misconduct or other questionable research practices. Again, people doing a good job spotting something that they should be clearing up. And while in Jeff Brainard's article, Hilda Bastian, who's a blogger and a researcher now at University in Gold Coast in Australia, she sort of reminds us that studying retractions is a bit of a tricky thing because the data are a bit messy. Perhaps this new database will help. Nick Stenek, who is also quoted in the article, he's at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, says, and I'm going to read this out, retractions have increased because editorial practices are improving and journals are trying to encourage editors to take retractions seriously. I buy that. I buy again that retractions are a sign of quality. They're when we're curating, publishers, research institutions, researchers themselves are curating problems with integrity or with ethics or with both, but that's all within the context of the peer-reviewed publishing process that we're entirely reliant on and used to govern all of this. But we're changing that process, right? This is where I introduce you all. We have new models, and to help us explore those models, we have Elisa de Ranieri, who is the editor-in-chief of Nature Communications now. Congratulations. And Elisa is going to represent evolution in the editorially mediated kinds of peer review. So Elisa's left is Diego Baptista, who is here to represent Wellcome Trust Open Research and will help us to understand author-mediated peer review. And to Diego's right is John Inglis from Cold Spring Harbor Labs, representing BioArchive, and he's going to help us to think about and explore community-mediated peer review. Through all of this discussion, we're going to need to ask ourselves whether we're happy with how we're looking after these essential aspects of quality, and who it is and how we're looking after these essential aspects of quality, namely ethics and integrity. Each of our panelists is going to give a brief opening statement, and then we're going to take a journey through these categories of discussion. So get your thoughts organized. We're going to start thinking about research ethics and integrity. Then we're going to think about publishing ethics and integrity and sort of good research authorship and editorial practices. And then we're going to think about the biggest possible picture and community ethics and integrity. And if at the end of that there's any time left before we close, we'll do AOB at the end. Sound all right? All right. Let's go, baby. Elisa, you're up first. Your slides are here. Please take the mic. Yep. Please welcome Elisa.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for sticking around this last session. So I'm going to represent the perspectives of the editor or publisher-mediated peer review, which is obviously the most traditional form of peer review that we're all familiar with. So I'm not going to spend spend a lot of time introducing this, but effectively we are talking about all the cases where an editor at a journal will coordinate the peer review process of the papers that are received by that journal. So, we're all kind of familiar with this model, but we are also familiar with the fact that this model has been evolving in the past, all the time, but in the past 5 to 10 years in particular, and it's not that black box that it used to be. New initiatives are constantly introduced that might be enabled by new technologies, for example, but also that are introduced to capture the evolving needs of the research community itself to make sure that we achieve a more robust peer review process that will also enable to achieve what Chris was talking about in terms of ethics and integrity in the field of research, in the field of publishing, and in the field of community more generally. So I should say that I have an editorial background. I've been an editor for many years at various Nature journals, and I can speak for all editors, I think, when I say that they are always keen to innovate and to sort of help the community because they have their best interest at heart. And sometimes delays in innovating the peer review model are mostly due to technology catching up with us as opposed to vice versa. So I'm just gonna, as Chris said, I've recently rejoined Nature Communication as its editor-in-chief, so I will use that journal to give you an example of a few initiatives that we've introduced in the past few years to make sure that we are achieving this robustness in the various ethics and integrity aspects that we've identified, and I've tried to color code the various categories to help you with that. So, even before Nature Communications launched, the other Nature titles started mandating author contribution statements. And then when the journal did launch, soon after they introduced various optional author services, such as double-blind peer review, where obviously the author can choose whether their identities are kept hidden from reviewers until the end of the process, and also transparent peer review. Since 2016, the journal publishes the reviewer reports and the author rebuttal, again, if the author decides to opt into the service. And more recently, we've launched what's called under consideration, which is effectively our way to support the preprint environment and to flag the preprints of articles that are currently under review at the journal. So they are listed in a page on our website. And I think what's really the nice fact that I take out of that initiative in particular is that the uptake is not extremely high, but of those authors that opt into this initiative, about two-thirds of them ends up depositing a preprint on a server after they've decided to take part in this initiative. So we are sort of changing researcher behavior in that sense. And last but not least, a few months ago, we introduced reviewer recognition. That is, again, an optional reviewer service this time, where reviewers can decide whether they would like to be acknowledged by name, where the paper that they reviewed to be published. Then again, so I think this is quite an impressive list already for just one journal, but there's always more that can be done, and I'm really keen personally that in 2019 we do try at least one of the other activities I've listed, and namely the introduction of registered reports as an article type. We really are keen to do that this year. And also maybe we could start publishing editorial letters to add a level of transparency to the review process. And finally, we're really keen to support the diversity in the research community, and we can do our part by making sure that the pool of reviewers that we use is diverse in itself. So really, in this editor-mediated peer review model, the ethics and integrity aspects of the process are championed and maintained by the editors and their publishers. So again, I'm going to talk about what I know, which is the Nature titles, where we have a pool of very competent professional in-house editors. They all have a PhD, most of them postdoc experience, and they really work with the research community to make sure that, to develop quality and reproducibility standards for doing and reporting research, and then they make sure that these standards are applied via editorial policies and also by requesting, for example, checklists at submission or during the peer review process from authors. And there was this nice study appeared on BioArchive last year, I think, by MacLeod, and there is, they found a measurable positive impact of these editorial policy changes on researcher behavior. So I think this is really positive. So then again, I think that the most important thing that our editors bring to the table is their independence. Because they are not active researchers anymore, they're full-time professional editors, they can be more objective when they make decisions because they have less competing interests than, for example, academic editors. So I think we could argue that the reviewer selection is one of the most essential steps in the whole process to ensure the integrity of the publishing process. So I think, again, our editors, because they have the competence through the experience that they have, but most importantly, as importantly, they have time, because that is their full-time job. They have really the time to provide a high-quality experience and to make sure that the whole peer review process is robust and done rigorously. So all of this, I think, fosters the integrity of the publishing process and also promotes ethics in research practices. So finally, I'd argue that there's still trust in the editor-mediated peer review model, even though we've highlighted some shortcomings and we are trying to fix, as I've described above. But publishers, can't sit on their laurels, because we need to really continue to strive and innovate, and we need to make sure that all the contributors, whether they're authors, reviewers, editors, and even the readers, that all of these contributors are more accountable for their part, and that the process is made more transparent, because obviously transparency and accountability can really improve trust and can therefore support and enable ethics and integrity. So, we can rely on technology. We can all wait for blockchain to come our way and save it the day, but I think that's not necessary. There's plenty of things that we can do before that happens. And in terms of transparency, I'm really talking about transparency of identity, content, and process. So we should really ultimately end up publishing the names of the reviewers and the editors, reviewer reports and the rebuttal, all the letters that have gone, emails that have been exchanged between editors and authors and reviewers. As a journal, we should really be open about the process that we employ in terms of times that various tasks take, but also which kind of procedures are we following. Sometimes this information is kind of hidden on journal website or not there at all. And again, really try and support the early disclosure of results, but also the disclosure of negative results, because there's a lot of wasted public money in just reproducing, trying to achieve results that have already been proven to be unachievable. And then again, things such as mandating data source. And lastly, I think we should, as publishers, step up on how we deal with competing interests, particularly in clinical studies and the life sciences in general, because obviously we do something about it, but we don't do enough, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that. So I think that's one item for us to focus on. And finally, I would like to end with a question for you all that maybe we can address later together, is whether all of this transparency can coexist with, maybe temporarily, withholding information, such as when we use double-blind peer review as a tool. And I would like to hear the views of everybody. So for now, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Elisa. Now, everybody, hold those thoughts in your mind. We're going to hear from Diego next. Come on, Diego. The microphone's yours. The clicker's here. Yep, all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks again for staying. So, as Chris mentioned, my name's Diego, and I work in the Open Research team at the Wellcome Trust, or Wellcome as we recently rebranded. And I'm excited to talk to you about Wellcome Open Research, and specifically how author-mediated peer review can enhance research ethics and integrity, community ethics and integrity, and publishing ethics and integrity. But before I do this, I think it's probably good to go over the publishing process at Wellcome Open Research, because it's slightly different, or very different, than what you might know. So Wellcome Open Research really empowers the author to decide when they think their content should be sort of out in the open. And this sort of throws back to sort of Judy's statement yesterday of we need to ask the researcher what they need. So I think Wellcome Open Research does a really good job of saying, when do you want your content out? When do you think it's ready? Because you decide. So the author will submit an article, and then it goes through some checks. So is the study ethical? Does it follow guidelines? Is it readable, written in a language that we understand, which is English? Is the data there? And is the data usable? Is it in a repository where they say it is? And can I download it? And so these sorts of quality checks. Once it's passed those checks, it can then go through open peer review. So they are provided a list of reviewers that might be suitable for their piece of work, or they can choose who they want to review it. And then it goes through open peer review and hopefully revision. And the entire process is open, transparent. We publish the review reports, we publish the rebuttals, and so you can see sort of the entire story. So I forgot to mention that there's incentive to do peer review in this process too, because once you get 2 positive peer reviews, you get indexed in Europe PubMed Central or PubMed Central. So it doesn't just sit on the platform, it then becomes a searchable piece of literature. When I look at this, I can identify the steps where we do support sort of, does this work? Yeah. research quality and integrity, so in this beginning step, and then also support community integrity through the open peer review, and publishing integrity also through the open peer review. So in this first step, when I'm talking about research ethics and integrity, I just want to go a little bit more detail of the quality control that WAR does, because I think the census is that anybody can put work on WAR, and you could put your garbage up there, but that's not true. So there are checks that happen. So we do look at, did they follow the guidelines for the study that they're proposing? We do make sure that they have a data availability statement and that you can download the data. And so I think this is how Wellcome Open Research really supports these 2 points. As far as publishing ethics go, after these initial checks have been completed, the authors, I think, are best suited to know who can add the best content or best review to their study. So an algorithm will generate a list, will show them who they could potentially pick for their peer review, and then they can pick this. So obviously some ethical rules apply to this. They can't choose someone that they've been collaborating with in the past year or someone publishing in the past 3 years. They could potentially pick their friends, but after working in research communities for quite a long time, I think if you're going to try to make your career in research and you pick your friends to review your work, people in your research community will find out, and you'll sort of lose credibility quite quickly. So I don't think that should be a valid concern or a huge concern. And additionally, this supports good publishing ethics because the whole process is transparent. So people who put their name on their peer reviews, they end up writing quality peer reviews because they're sort of putting their neck on the line, right? They have to judge the experiments or the paper that they're looking at in an appropriate way. Researchers deeply care about sort of their reputation. And the openness of the review enhances the quality of these publications, right? So we have not only the peer review reports that are signed and open, but the rebuttals that are signed and open, obviously. And I think these are really integral parts of the story that someone might be publishing. You as a reader should be able to read the peer review reports and make your own decision on whether or not the extra experiments that were required or asked for did actually add to the publication. And I think this is rich data that's part of the story that you might not get a piece of. And finally, I want to talk about how we can support community ethics and integrity. So peer reviews can be cited on Wellcome Open Research, which is really nice. The number of reviews that I wrote as a PhD student that I didn't get credit for is quite a lot. So you can sort of raise your profile as a researcher by having peer reviews within your particular field, right? You can gain credibility much earlier in your career than just having been on a paper. Additionally, since the reviews are signed, you don't run into, or we hope that you won't run into this selfish behavior of, I'm going to give this person a bad review because I'm working on a similar thing and I want to publish sooner. Since the review's out there, you probably wouldn't be able to exhibit that behavior. And I guess in summary, I think Wellcome Open Research is quite a different model for how publishing can work, but really puts the researcher at the center of who's making the decisions on publication. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Diego. So we've heard from Elisa on editor-mediated peer review. We've heard from Diego on author-mediated peer review. Now we're going to hear from John on community-mediated peer review. There you go.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Chris and Anu for the invitation to do this. And in the interests of gender balance, I want to make the point that I am a late and poor substitute for Naomi Penfold from ASAP Bio. Let me see. There we are. So I am here from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, where I serve in a variety of roles, and I have a couple of advisory roles with MIT Press and the Royal Society as well. My particular point in being here, or purpose in being here, is to talk about a preprint server which my colleague Richard Sever and I founded 5 years ago, as one of several services which Cold Spring Harbor has actually served to the research community for about 80 of its 120-year history. BioArchive is free. It's free service for both authors and readers. It has various forms of integration with journals from a large number of publishers, some of which I hope we'll get into later. And since 2017, it's been supported by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. The server has a rising rate of submission, currently around 2,000 manuscripts a month. And each one of those submissions is assigned to one particular subject category, and the author is asked to label her results as either new or confirmatory or contradictory. Right now, there are 40,000 manuscripts on the service, half of which arrived in the last 12 months. And that content is getting about 4 to 5 million views and downloads each month. I have to say that there are a number of preprint servers serving many disciplines, and they do not all work the same way, so I'm going to be talking very specifically about the way that BioArchive works. It's a preprint server, it's not a journal, and right from the start, we tried to make that distinction entirely clear, and we did so in a variety of ways. As you have heard, journals have responsibilities for both dissemination and the assessment and certification of work. You all know that in this particular community. A preprint server, though, decouples dissemination from certification, and the aim of doing that is to put the recent results in the hands of the community as early as possible and when the authors choose to do that. And that's a process we believe that benefits science, it benefits the investigator, and potentially also benefits the publication process when that occurs. And as Angela Cochran said eloquently yesterday, a preprint server cannot, and in our view should not, do many of the things that a journal does. And those things that a journal does are very much designed, as you've heard from my colleagues here, to ensure that the publication process is ethical and accountable. What we do is screening, not peer review, and to do that at the kind of scale we're operating at, that requires a streamlined process. So at submission, we ask the author only to declare two things. She has the right to post the manuscript, and the manuscript has not been accepted or published in a journal. And we will be adding some additional options, not requirements, later this year, one of them being the opportunity to post a link to the place where data is available should the author choose to be sharing that. So the screening step is conducted partly in-house. Our screening team checks for scope, appropriateness or inappropriateness of the different kinds that I've listed here, including plagiarism check. And they also make sure that the article is of a type that we accept. The purpose of BioArchive is to accelerate research and to do that by providing access to research papers, not all the outputs that scientists create. And there are lots of types of articles that we don't take: commentaries, editorials, N of 1 case studies, reviews, and so on. After the first step, the manuscript goes into a pool where it's made available to a group of scientific affiliates. These are about 120 principal investigators with diverse backgrounds and locations. And their job is to confirm that the manuscript is a research paper, that it's appropriate for a professional level audience, and they also alert us to any concerns that they have about the implications of the content. That could be dual-use research, as Chris indicated, with consequences for public health or animal health, or the environment, or national security in the case of biohazard. Also, does the content address health issues such as that could be of concern to the public, such as vaccine safety or disease transmission, the efficacy of drugs, the carcinogenicity of particular compounds. If a manuscript does generate that kind of concern, it comes back to the BioArchive staff for further scrutiny, and it may well be declined with an explanation to the author as to why that has happened. At this point, we have declined between 6 and 10% of the submissions, but in the vast majority of cases, that's because it's an article type that we don't permit. So once a manuscript is posted, it's now available to the community for reaction. And that reaction comes through many channels. Twitter conversation is extremely important. The expansion of the character set to 280 characters has allowed actually substantial conversations to take place around particular papers. We have direct on-site commenting as well, and authors report that most of the time what they receive is personal, private communication by email or in person. But we are beginning to see some new initiatives of more organized and formal kind to provide an assessment of preprints. And I see that I've called this process review in the slide, which I think actually is wrong, and assessment would be a much better word. I'm going to talk about just briefly 3 initiatives that have gained some traction. They're not the only ones by any means. But I'm grateful to the instigators of these projects who've given me the data that I see that I'm showing here. The first of them is Prelights, which is a project of the company of biologists in Cambridge. They've assembled a pool of about 130 mostly early career researchers who choose a preprint and then write a news and views type commentary about it. The authors aren't consulted, but they do have the right of reply. And the commentary and any response is posted on the Prelights website, and BioArchive links from the appropriate preprint to that commentary. So far, there are about 270 articles. The second initiative, PreReview, was started by 3 young postdocs. Well, they were postdocs at the time, now actually all active in various forms of science communication. In fact, one of them is on the BioArchive team, although PreReview is an independent project. So their aim is to train early career researchers in basically how to do peer review and how to get recognition for it. And they chose to focus on preprints because the manuscript is readily available and it hasn't been published. So the metaphor they use is basically an online journal club. It self-aggregates around a selected preprint. There's a collaborative discussion of it, which is then written up and posted on the PreReview's website. Some of those are then also posted on the manuscript, on the BioArchive manuscript on our site. And BioArchive makes a link to that commentary. Again, the authors are not consulted about the selection, but they do have the opportunity to respond and have a conversation with their commentators. And actually, PreReview, rather interestingly, has organized 4 live streaming events where a set of very brave authors show up and are questioned by an audience all in real time. So far, there are about 50 of these collective commentaries that are available for your review. And the third of these initiatives is called Peer Community In. It was begun by a group of French biologists. Their aim is different. Their aim is to identify and recommend what they call outstanding preprints. So in this process, authors choose to submit a manuscript to the peer community that's appropriate, evolutionary biology or ecology, for example. Then there is an editorial process which results in a recommendation, or maybe not, depending on what a group of editors think the response to the work has been. So far, there have been about 88, I think, submissions, and about half of them have been selected or recommended. So it's not unlike a journal in that respect. And this is obviously about as close as any of these initiatives have come to conventional peer review. And in fact, on the PCI site, they list 9 journals whose editors have agreed that the nature of the commentary that has been generated is sufficiently valuable to take into account the peer review process when the manuscript is submitted. So I should make the point, if I haven't already, that in each of these cases, the manuscript stays on BioArchive, and the authors still have the opportunity to submit the manuscript to the journal of their choice. However, what you can see is what's missing from any of these initiatives is a non-manual way of collecting up the conversation that has happened around an individual preprint, attaching it to the preprint's journey into the publication process, and ensuring that the community reaction is taken into account when the manuscript is formally peer-reviewed for publication. And that process is what we are thinking about right now, and I would be interested in your comments about how that might be made to work. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John. That was brilliant. Thanks to each of our speakers and panelists. We've had, I'll say it again, editor-mediated peer review discussed, author-mediated peer review discussed, and community-mediated peer review discussed. Now it's over to you, kind of, right? We're going to have conversation through each of these sort of chapters, if you like, of the Q&A session, and I have kind of a mischievous sort of alter ego that I'm going to put on to ask a seeding question at the start of each chapter. Well, actually, that depends on how the questions come from the audience, right? But I'm going to seed the first question anyway, and here's my mischievous alter ego, right? A skeptical version of me might say, hey, we're not publishers. Sorry, no, we are publishers. Got that wrong. We're not researchers, we're publishers. Why should we care about research ethics? And I'll ask just one of our panelists to respond to that. And then we can go over to onward conversation amongst us all. So, Elisa, why should we care about research ethics?
Yeah, happy to take that. Is this working? Yeah, happy to take that, given that I've spoken about this type of peer review. So I think the publishers and editors are there for a reason, to support the dissemination of scientific research and to do that in a way that it's efficient and effective and contributes to the advancement of society in general. So I think it would be very wrong for publishers to just say, oh, research ethics, not my problem because I'm downstream of that. So that would be just wrong, because as I've shown earlier, there are ways that we can even influence researcher behavior and make sure that research ethics is applied and improved. So, why should we shy away from that? We have an active role to play, and that's why I argue that also, the strength of the editor-mediated peer review model is exactly that, is to sort of influence research behavior to uphold values of research ethics and integrity.
Thank you. So you're saying we are part of the research endeavour. We're not a publishing island doing its own thing on its own. Would that be fair?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Okay, well, I would offer, if the other panellists want to add anything there, then you'd be very welcome. John, you would? Okay, good. And then we will go over to everybody here. So, John.
I mean, it's a relatively, I think, trivial point, but much of the kind of research that we're all involved in the distribution of comes from the public purse, and we are part of the responsibility of handling the consequences of research in a way that works for society at large, and that obviously has to involve integrity and the proper handling of that information.
So responsibilities to the world at large rather than just our owners, right, shareholders and so on. Diego, you look like you want to add something. You're very welcome.
I agree with both of you entirely. I mean, I think it's kind of a moot point. Publishers have to be excited and play a role in influencing researcher ethics. It's obvious to me, I think.
So that's the kind of leadership role, right? Yeah. Influencing researcher ethics. Great stuff. All right. Well, thank you all for commenting on that. Please, now it's your turn. Who'd like to raise their hand? We've got 1, 2, 3 that I can see already. Leonid, we'll go with you first, please.
To John Lennish, another journalist. John, what is the impact factor of BioArchive?
So,
I was joking.
Well, you know, when you put BioArchive into the Google search box, roughly 1 down or 2 down is the search term BioArchive impact factor.
That's what I asked.
So, but I have yet to find what that number actually is. So if you find it,
I will tweet
let me know. I'd really like to be
okay?
made aware of that.
No, actually, what I want to ask you, I was hoping you will mention Richard Serra's idea of Plan U, because we spoke yesterday all the day about the Plan S, which now nobody knows where it's going. But Plan U is really great, and it's so doable. And everybody would be happy. Even Elsevier and Springer Nature would be happy. What the funders have to do, they have to mandate preprints, and then it would evolve from there. So
what
I don't know if you want to talk about it.
You're saying please talk about Plan U.
Plan U, yeah.
Right, and has that got, is that on topic with integrity and ethics, or is it something we should hold for AOB at the end, would you say? I'd be love to talk about it, but...
I think, Chris, if we have time, I don't really think it falls into the main topic of this. I'm happy to talk about it at the end, but let's defer it until then.
Okay, let's hold it. Plan U, coming back later. Bernd, I saw your hand go up, so please, microphone, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, Bernd Pulver from EMBO. I have 2 questions. One is on referee credit. We're now in a situation where we are posting our referee comments and we are making them citable. That's great. In the biosciences, many people are not quite ready to sign their reports, so it's not that easy to assign credit to these referees. And I would like to ask Diego from the Wellcome Trust if there is a mechanism he can envisage for you to make these things nonetheless machine readable and transparent to you as a funder, so then you can then apply credit to your fundees who have done great reviewing job for EMBO without publicly disclosing necessarily the names. That was the first point, and then the second question is to, can you remember that? Okay,
I got it written down, I'll repeat it, it's all good.
Okay, the second one is quickly on the one of the key bottlenecks in refereeing is serial review, where people resubmit to another journal and then to a third journal before they get published, and they get new referees every time, so we end up with 15 referees before paper is published. Can John imagine to use the preprint platform to actually make these referee reports more reusable? If people who decide to post a preprint can post the referee reports they received from their rejecting journal, and other journals could pick them up from there and use them.
Wow. Crikey, Bernd, you do ask complicated questions, but I think I got that one. We'll do the first one first, which was for you, Diego. It's something along the lines of, can referee credit be useful to research funders?
Right, so do we give credit to someone for writing good reviews? I think I want to address your people are scared to put their names on reviews first. And sure, we can think of mechanisms to go around this, but I think we do have the responsibility to make people not afraid to sign their name to their work, and sort of enhance research integrity and sort of community integrity by giving people gold stars for signing their reviews. I'm sure we could have some back-end system where the journal will communicate to a funder who wrote these reviews, and I'm sure our impacts and analysis team would love to have that information, but I don't see that as any different to having closed review as it is currently, other than funders may benefit from it.
Thank you. Good. Elisa would like to add to that, and then we'll go to the second question with you, John.
Yeah, and just to say that there are such mechanisms already, like ORCID and Pablons, right? There are integration that these systems can be integrated with submission systems, so that this information anonymously reach the funders or whoever wants to access it. So I think, but I fully agree with you that that's just a technological problem, but the main problem is cultural. How do we get to the point where everybody's confident in signing their report and not just shying away from it?
Yeah, so it's taking friction out of the technology so that it works easily for everybody, but it's also about winning hearts and minds so that people embrace more transparency that enables credit to be awarded for peer review. John, do you want to address that, or do you want me to repeat Bernd's second part of his question?
I think I remember what Bernd said, but just in relation to this, which is very interesting, there's a lot of obviously now about publishing reviews, which many publishers and journals have been doing for quite some time, but not publishing signed reviews. And the kind of conversations I tend to get involved in the bar at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which often involves younger investigators, is a very strong expression of concern about the consequences of signing something that might well be very critical, but belongs to a much more senior person in the community. The possibilities for retribution in academic life are quite large, and there's a genuine concern about that. So I think it's probably, well, I think you said, Elisa, it's a cultural issue. Perhaps technology can solve the cultural issue. I'm not sure how. You mentioned blockchain. Maybe that's part of the solution. But I do think that's a very great concern for early career investigators.
Good addition. So then the second question was something like, how do we reuse and avoid the waste around peer reviews, perhaps using the preprinting mechanism? So please.
Well, so this feeds into response to Bernd's question, because one of the characteristics of the two of the three peer preprint assessment projects that I mentioned is that the name of the commentator is prominently displayed. So you could say that this is, well, in fact, one must say, this is not peer review as we know it. This is mostly, I think, a way of highlighting work that is highly regarded, which, as we all know from the peer review process, is not always the case. So while it might be valuable to capture, as I said, the conversation that is going on at that level around a preprint, we're mostly going to be biased in the direction of approving assessment, not critical assessment. Although, I have to say, in some of the Twitter conversations or some of the comments on BioArchive that are directly on the site, there is criticism, there is the suggestion of how an interpretation might be changed or an analysis might be made better. So there are the seeds of possibility there. To answer your question eventually, Bernd, there are some seeds that could be cultivated, but I think we need to work on this a bit better and try and figure out a way of doing this in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences for those who are brave enough to put their head above the parapet.
Great stuff. Thank you for that. I feel the need for my mischievous alter ego to return. However, Damien Pattinson, you've got your hand up. Why don't you ask your question first, and then the evil Chris will return.
Okay, well, I don't want to block the evil Chris, but a quick question was to the panel. Do you think that the integrity checks should be standardized across all journals, or are they a way in which journals can compete on the kind of rigor of their checks?
All right, so consolidated standards for integrity checks or competition over who does it best. What do we think? Who'd like to go first?
I can go first. I think there should be a shared standard, like a basic standard level that all publishers and journals adhere to, in the sense that could be like the checks could be standardized. And I can see also a world where some journals are stricter than others, and that would also be fine. And this will be also discipline dependent, obviously, because various disciplines have different criteria. So yeah, I think to answer your question, I think that there should be a way for standardizing at least some of the checks to enable all papers that go into a submission system to have a certain level of validation, if you like, even before the peer review process starts. So I think that's definitely scope for that. That could be also a level of degree by which certain journals might want to go beyond that, but that's, that might be of a very small number of journals.
So that's a yes from Elisa for standardization. Very good. Diego.
And a resounding yes from me, although I think you might have to be quite careful about different disciplines and sort of the standards that you would have there. Some people might disagree with this, but a lot of different disciplines might say, I can't meet this standard ever, when you think it might be a standard that's quite important. So.
Good response, Diego. Thank you. John? Yeah.
Yes, I think Diego makes a very good point that integrity checks in bioinformatics are not the same as integrity checks in experimental cancer research. So that's one thing we need to bear in mind. I'm not sure if, Damien, you're thinking about the application of technology. I mean, I'm thinking about image manipulation assessment, for example, where one can run the figure through a process, but then it needs a human to interpret what that actually means. And there can be great variation in the skill of that interpretation and the consequences of whatever that interpretation is. So, it's a weaselly kind of answer, but I think it's a combination of maybe standardized technologies with some kind of best practices around what the humans who are using the technology actually, how they interpret it.
Thank you. Good answers. Seems like we need standardization for integrity checks. Let's start work on that tomorrow. So my evil alter ego is going to come back now, okay? God, I told myself I wasn't going to try and do the Blofeld laugh, but anyway, there you go. So right, here we go. I'm Evil Chris now. You're putting authors in the driving seat, right? And each of you is doing that to a greater or lesser extent. Evil Chris says that's a dereliction of our responsibility, right? We're creating an absence of control, an absence of publishing standards. Do we really want the kind of low quality that we're enabling? Are we really ready for publishing ethics anarchy? Who wants to take that? Or is that too evil? John?
Well, and I know from talking to the pioneers of preprints at Archive that they had the same kind of conversations that we had when we embarked on BioArchive, which was a feeling that all that will ever be put there is low-quality work that can't get published, can't get distributed in any other way. And that is such a misapprehension because most of the time all that scholars have is reputation. And that reputation is looked at closely, just to your point, Diego, about finding reviewers. So to some extent, I think the Academy is self-policing. I don't think it can happen entirely alone, and our job is to facilitate that. But primarily, we are working with communities who have values, standards, ethics of their own, and we should do our best to reflect whatever those particular communities are.
Thank you. Diego, you look like you're ready.
Yeah, so, obviously, being behind Wellcome Open Research, where we put the author really at the driving seat, I think, yes, that authors should we should have this publishing ethics anarchy that you mentioned. But I agree with John, too, in that it can't be entirely independent. There still needs to be some sort of check and balance, right? We can't support the researcher who picks his or her friends to review all of their papers, or support the researcher who will not give someone a job because they gave them a poor review, 3 years ago. Publishers have to somehow sort of integrate into this system.
Okay, so you vote for putting the author in charge. Very good. Elisa, what would you add? And then we'll go to everybody else for more thoughts and comments and questions.
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add. I think that already raised good points. I think to some extent we have to trust the research communities to do the things that are in their own best interest. Of course, we also need to have systems in place to pick when things go wrong. And I'm not saying that the systems can't exist in the author-mediated peer review. They can fully exist.
Right, and I guess the more transparent we become across our operations as publishers and across the research process itself, then the more visible good behaviors are, right? And that seems to be a system way to approach encouraging good behaviors, right? Okay, thank you, everybody. Questions? Yes, right at the front. Ed, please. And then let's talk about gender here a minute, right? No, let's not. We've had questions from men so far, so.
So, Ed Gerstner, Director of Journal Policy and Strategy at Springer Nature. To the question of policing, how do you feel, and particularly to Diego, about the authors choosing referees? How would you engage an anti-vaxxer submitting a paper and then choosing anti-vaxxer referees?
So an anti-vaxxer paper with the right kinds of referees, how do you do it?
There would have to be ethics behind this paper, given, is it citing, I think, the paper that you're mentioning before, which has been debunked? Then I would hope the people at F1000 would throw it away initially.
Follow-up question. Let's not talk about anti-vaccination. Let's talk about fields where tribes have developed, where there's one tribe that believes this way, another tribe believes in this way, and another tribe believes in this way. How do you get a mixture? How do you make sure that papers get exposed to the ideas from the other tribes?
Sure. If you're trying to promote yourself within your tribe and only use your tribe to support yourself, you're never going to convince the other people. So I would say it's in the author's best interest to include those other tribes in the peer review. Yeah.
No, we'll see, won't we? It's an interesting point, though, isn't it? Thanks for asking the question. Yeah, there's a microphone right here, please.
Sorry, I got ahead of you there.
Yeah.
This is related. I'd be very interested, again, fantastic panel. I'd be very interested in the panelists' thoughts around diversity, not diversity by identity or tribe, or not diversity by identity, but really around diversity of thought. And I think this gets back to this issue of tribes. We live in a culture now where it's becoming increasingly difficult for people of different tribes to actually allow these ideas to collide, which is really part of the iterative process. How can we further iterate on peer review to ensure greater integrity of the actual review process by diversifying around the thoughts that have to contribute in order to get the best possible science and outcome? Thank you.
Wow. I'd like to try and synthesize that question and reflect it to the panel, but looks like you're ready to go and I'm struggling, so please go for it.
Now, if I understand correctly, I think one of the strengths of having professional or any editor that coordinates the peer review process, as I was saying, referee selection is very key, because if you get that wrong, you end up publishing rubbish and you end up not publishing great work, right? So I think the way I see it is that the strength of the editor-mediated model is that editors are not active researchers anymore, but they're well, they know their communities very well because they travel, they interact with tons of researchers, and they can assess whether, if it's a paper on tribe A, that should be reviewed by somebody in tribe B, and they can make that decision, and they can, in that sense, ensure that there is as little bias in the process as is possible. Of course, there always is some unconscious bias that we all have because we're humans, but I think editors in their role have the power to try and actively go against that bias, and therefore trying to select the reviewer panel in a way that is, that the result is as unbiased as possible, if I understand.
Yeah, I think that's right. That does address the question. So editors can address selecting and incorporating the right kinds of diversity into their peer review model, and presumably then transparency around what happened demonstrates that diversity of thought and other things. So I think you addressed the question very well. Diego, you...
Yeah, so I goes back to Ed's question too of do you get stuck in your thought bubbles? And I guess really fundamentally when I think about it, your thought bubble is not going to go, you and your thought bubble is not going to go very far if you keep it closed, right? So if all the reviews are open, they're signed, at least in the war model, and so people know who you are and people know what you're thinking about this particular article or piece of work. And again, I'm going to say it, and I know you don't believe me, but it's in the author's best interest to sort of try to cross those lines, per se.
Right, interesting, good comment. John?
I'd echo what Elisa said about the value of the editorial process. And while we're at it, let's hear it for professional editors, a class of person that is often maligned, in my view, very badly and mistakenly by professional academics. The great virtue of being a professional editor is that you are above the battle, and that's very hard for say, an editor-in-chief who happens to be inevitably part of a tribe. The art of choosing an editor-in-chief is to choose someone who's capable both of, being violent in the ring, but also sitting in the referee's chair in a reasonably detached way. So, but I don't want to lose the point you were making about the diversity of opinion. I think one of many virtues of early sharing of research manuscripts is that it's an opportunity to hear those voices from many quarters, not always signed. And of course, we are still very early in this process, and the methods of, well, first of all, getting people to actually comment is a challenge, and getting a diversity of people to comment is a challenge, and then having an understanding of who those people are and what they represent when the manuscript becomes part of the formal publication process. All of those things are still things that have to be solved, but I think the move towards early sharing is helping surface a diversity of opinion, and let's face it, it has to be better than sending it to 3 people.
Right, early sharing helps engage many voices. Good comment, thank you. We have a question at Liz at the back. You've got the microphone, right?
I have,
just about see you.
Liz Marchant, Taylor and Francis. Philippe yesterday talked a bit about hidden value, and I know just how much my team spends their time, effort and brains on tackling different ethics cases. And it's a big and complicated part of our lives as publishers. We don't talk about it a lot. We're a bit polite. We don't like to share quite how much happens. The researcher incentive framework, this is high stakes to get published. And I think Diego perhaps illustrated there the lack of understanding of how much pressure researchers are under to get published. And it leads to quite strange behaviours. What's your comment on that? What should we do about it?
Comment, please, on strange behaviours.
That was me being polite again.
That's very good. Diego, you have the microphone. Would you like to address this?
I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I would love to talk to you more in depth about it. One thing that maybe outside of what Wellcome Open Research does with peer review is, Wellcome does things with our policy, our publishing policy, or open access policy, for example, where we try to inject like DORA into universities and try to get them to start judging people based on the quality of their science rather than where they've published. And so trying to influence researcher behavior this way, I'm not entirely sure in peer review how we can have a direct influence on this because we don't mandate war, for example.
Thank you. Evil Chris has a comment here, but maybe one of our good colleagues would like to add a thought too.
No, I'm not sure I got the problem right, but if I did, I can only second that the fact. I can only second what you said in terms of how much time publishers spend in ensuring that certain maybe integrity cases are dealt with, and they're dealt with, professionally and efficiently, etc. So I think then again, this is, in my views, obviously as a professional publisher, that's again one of the things that normally, as you were saying, they get overlooked. The value that publishers bring to the table in that sense gets overlooked, and that's one of the strengths that we do have. And I can only reiterate how, maybe it's something that we should brag more about it and make it more transparent to the rest of the community. What is it that we do? Because if we were not to exist anymore and all that was available was author-mediated or community-mediated peer review, and I'm saying they are bad, but I'm just saying maybe we will see the gaps that publishers have been filling, they will become more evident if we were not there.
Okay, good. John, to add to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are several things I guess I'd like to say about it. So one is that every community has elements of bad behavior in it. You're absolutely right. The pressure of staying in academic life, being supported by grants, winning grants in a competitive environment, all of that puts enormous pressure on the scholars involved. that's an explanation for bad behavior, but not an excuse. The problem starts long before the manuscript arrives at a journal. The problem comes in an institute, in a university department, in a research group. One of the books that I commissioned years ago, because I could see how poorly educated principal investigators were in how to run a research group. That's the book that we've reprinted many, many times. It's been through a couple of editions. But what it doesn't have is a section on how you train your trainees to behave ethically when it comes to the communication of science. And we're moving towards a new edition, and that will definitely have to be part of their content. So there's a training element required, and academic institutions have to be diligent and vigilant and be prepared to wreak consequences of bad behavior on the people who are discovered to have perpetrated something wrong. I think your point about the time and the anguish involved in investigating these sorts of cases is very well taken. Sometimes there can be an enormous amount of time and energy expended. Then there's a result, and people don't like the result, and the process is then criticized, and the result is criticized as well. So sometimes it's a question of being, damned if you do and damned if you don't. But all of the stakeholders in the communication process have a role to play here in ensuring that there is honesty, there is integrity, and there is responsibility. And we are definitely, as a community, capable, I think, of doing all of this stuff better.
Thank you. You seem to say, it's the institution's thing, right? And lots of people say that, and it's partially true. And also, maybe I'm, overextending what you said, so don't, play along here a bit, right? We've said here in this panel, and it has been expressed at other times during this meeting, that journals do have enormous influence. And I wonder what the panel would say about how we can use that influence to enable kind of more collaborative and collegial conversations around the research that we help researchers to publish. Maybe if we can start to encourage that using our influence, then we're beginning to help the research institutions to solve the sort of source problem, if you know what I mean. So how would you respond to that? Diego, you look like John's handing you the mic. You're in.
There we go. So, I mean, I don't want to ask a community to spread themselves too thin, because there's already quite a lot of value that's added. But if funders or publishers could think of ways to reward researchers not for just this paper they have, but for being a really good mentor or for having a very diverse laboratory. And I mean, these are just questions that I've thought of and obviously don't have any solutions to them, but things to think about, stuff like that.
Good. Thank you. Elisa?
Yeah, and I think, as we were saying earlier, just to, publishers have a role in working with the community to come up with standards for reproducibility, for quality of data, etc. And this is something that we shouldn't underestimate, the power of how much that influence can result in changes in behavior.
Anything to add, John?
Yeah, it just really actually occurred to me, the talk today particularly about the availability of data. I think it hadn't really occurred to me before, but suppose if we move more towards the communication not just of conclusions and a narrative form of a research story, but there is a requirement and it becomes a kind of community norm for the actual data to be available. That seems to me to be a potential seriously good way of preventing bad behavior or discouraging bad behavior, because certain kinds of bad behavior anyway, not all of it. But transparency, what was it, the antiseptic effect of sunlight, somebody said something about that. Transparency and openness has very beneficial effects in that sense. So the more we move towards data publishing, perhaps, the less of a problem this will become, as Liz has said so eloquently.
Very good. I'm not sure that we're going to face a decrease in the number of ethics and integrity cases that you, Liz, and I and others have to manage. I think that might be another, 10, 20-year thing rather than a tomorrow thing. More questions. We have some over here and one over there. Let me. Who's a voice that we haven't heard from yet? Can we go to you in the middle here? I don't know your name. I'm sorry, Stephanie. And then we'll do the rest of you. Don't fret.
Stephanie Dawson from Science Open. I had a question about tools that are any of you working on to somehow support peer reviewers in identifying papers with good scientific rigor or poor scientific rigor. Are there some kind of automatic checks that could be done? We talked about a sort of a general first check for manuscripts, but maybe that could go a little bit farther, because there have been numerous studies that show that peer reviewers are actually not very good at picking up problems in manuscripts. There's long checklists, and it seems that there must be a way that computers can help speed up that review process, help humans concentrate on the things that humans are good at, and maybe put some of those tasks to computers. So I was wondering if you or anybody here is working on
how do we get machines and tools into the peer review process to relieve some of the hard work?
From this perspective of ethics and integrity.
Yeah,
so
good.
really just scientific rigor.
Good question. We have a hand here, but we'll go to the panel first, please.
This is something I'm very interested from sort of sitting as a funder. If you have any great ideas or know people, I would love to talk to you.
Okay, good. Elisa.
Yeah, well, I think as you were saying, I think we should ideally, or as we were saying earlier, in terms of basic standards that can be done even before peer review starts, of image manipulation and all sorts of things. I think we as an industry are lagging behind that, because in 2019 it's surprising that we don't have that yet for all papers. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that that's one aspect, automated checks that can be done even before peer review starts. The other thing that we are doing is to make the data and the code more available to reviewers. So we started a pilot with CodeOcean for a few of the Nature titles, and that is so we partner with this external provider, and they provide a platform in which reviewers that have to review papers that have a lot of code in it can download the code, test it for themselves, even with their own data, and that gives an extra sort of gives them some leg to actually make sure that this code is valid. So I think there's quite a lot of these initiatives going around. It's just a matter of, again, I think platform and technology to catch up with the rest of us and making sure that these tools are widely spread across all publishers and for all platforms.
And perhaps in the meantime using people to solve the problems that machines can't address right away. We have perhaps a response to that question. Your hand is raised, please do, and then we'll do one or two more questions from the front, I think.
I'm Nancy Rodden, Director of Publications
Nancy.
for ASBME, the JBC. And we have hired 4 people on staff to review images prior to publication. And that's a really very big process and a big cost. And we are training the authors, because most of the issues are not done on purpose. They're sloppy, or they just don't know better. So we're trying to help the authors and educate them and let them know what they've done wrong prior to publication. So we're improving their article so that it's not retracted after it's published. Right. But that's a big cost that, authors are not going to want to pay for that. And it's something that we have seen a very large number of our articles have issues. And so there are the ones that need to be retracted or declined prior to publication because of ethical issues. But when we do work when we do have a retraction, we do work with the institutions. Not all institutions are willing to work with us or want to say that there is a problem. So there's lots of issues here. If the funders could help prior to publication, that would be tremendous. And maybe it could even be done after the BioArchive stage.
I'm interested in that. So right now you're using a people-powered process that doesn't feel like it's going to scale. We need tech solutions for this. That's how we get to scale, and I don't think anybody's got those right now. But maybe we'll get there. Right, we have a couple of questions that were stacking up at the front that we've just about got time to address. Heads or tails. Let's go left. Please, the microphone here.
This might tie into something you opened with on retractions and John's recent comment about the responsibility of a research institution to teach researchers how to do research ethically and properly. We share that as publishers. We share that with publishing associations like yours, COPE. We share with the scientific societies that our researchers are a member of. We can all be working together to teach these things, and we do, I think, for the most part. But one thing we don't do enough of is show the general public or the general press that we do these things. If you remember when that Brainerd article came out, there was a cover story in The Economist that said science is in huge trouble. They didn't quote the 0.04% of the retraction, and I wrote a letter to The Economist pointing out that they never published their error rate, nor does any other of the general press.
Right.
So we have a shared responsibility that as publishers, as publishing associations, as scientific associations, and our home institutions to teach ourselves how to do this.
Teach ourselves to tell the story about the good work that we're doing and the value that we're adding and bringing. Michael, we'll go to you for probably what will be our final question. Let's see.
Yes, Michael Forster, IEEE. I feel a little cynical focusing on the sticks rather than the carrots. But John, you pointed out that any society has bad actors. And earlier we acknowledged, I think, that publishing and research are really an integrated community. Most communities also have rules, norms, and methods for adjudication and sanctions against those bad actors. So I guess I'd like to kind of pose to the community the questions of, are we doing an adequate job of those kinds of aspects of managing a community?
Okay, so a question on sanctions and whether we're doing a good enough job of understanding what those sanctions are and then applying them when they need to be applied. Who wants to have a go at that? Was it directed at you? Diego, you've got the microphone. Go for it.
This happens a lot here. So I'm not sure how to talk about this through the lens of peer review, but I guess I can talk about it through Wellcome's stance. We just recently released an anti-bullying policy. So if you're working at a research institution and you get bullied by your boss, who is funded by us, you come to us, we investigate it, we'll take away their funding. So I think that sanction is quite good and aggressive, I hope. And the same goes for our open access policy. So I'm personally responsible for doing the compliance checking. And when people misbehave, we say, we'll stop giving you money. Most people behave.
Well, I was brought up as a Scottish Puritan, so tarring and feathering is never very far from my mind.
It's not allowed. John Inglis.
I think that we have to be maybe a little bit more subtle about the appropriation, about the allocation of blame and so on. I mean, Nancy made the point that in her investigations of image manipulation, and Bernd has many years of experience of doing this as well, the vast majority of the time it's people being, over-exuberant with Photoshop, rather than deliberately trying to pull a fast one over the editor-in-chief of the Embo Journal. So I think one has to make a distinction here, and my worry about the sort of naming and shaming game is that you will end up damaging, perhaps permanently, the prospects of a young talented, slightly over-enthusiastic person at a stage in their career when they don't fully understand the entire contours of the game. It's not that I want to excuse bad behavior, I just have a bit of a concern about how we go about identifying poor behavior and what we then do about it.
I love that response. Nuanced kindness, really, in the way that we approach these things. Thank you. Elisa?
Maybe I can add something in terms of poor behavior from reviewers, because that also happens in terms of people being overcritical or conversely over positive, because ultimately there is some conflict of interest that they haven't disclosed to the editors. And again, we handle that not in a very sort of systematic way, in the sense that we don't have a protocol, but I'm pretty sure when I say that every editorial list that I know will have, a list in their head of bad reviewers, and the sanction is that those people are not invited to review again. And in that sense, we have this control mechanism to make sure that we pick the bad apples and chuck them away. So I'm not saying that we keep a bad list register, but this is just in people's heads, but it works fine, I think.
Good, thank you. We each of us prepared a closing statement. So we're ready to deliver those, but I reckon we've got time for one more question before we do our closing statements. So yes, Eva, it's yours. You need a microphone though, please wait for the microphone.
A question to you. We talked a lot about images, but in some areas a lot of discussion around review and all kinds of after discussions after publication come because not referencing and citing enough or the right works just in a proper way. And I do wonder whether this couldn't be automized much better. So if somebody is citing, is the citation, the reference list, an ethical one? And I guess their automation could help a lot.
Thank you for the question. So it's sort of about citation ethics. And when have you cited the things that you are obliged to do by your community? Who'd like to address that?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure how that could be fully automated, because we have that. That's one of our sort of review criteria that we ask both reviewers and our editors to comment on in terms of is prior work cited appropriately. And I think only a human with the experience of that particular research field can really say, yeah, these are the major works that should have been cited and they have, or conversely something is missing. That's of course not to say that we don't get cases where a reviewer gets particularly keen that their own work is cited and those are dealt with appropriately, but I think, I'm all up for automation where it's possible. I'm just not sure myself how we could automate in this particular case.
Good stuff, thank you. Diego? Or John, any responses to that maybe? Go
ahead. I agree with Elisa that I don't think you can remove the human element from citation choices that a scholar makes. The citation behavior is complex. There are reasons why people choose a particular paper to cite, and they may be endorsing it or they may be criticizing it. And actually there is a company that is trying to use AI techniques to actually sort out just that very simple difference. When does this citation support this other citation, or does it not? And I'm not sure they're quite there yet, but they're certainly making efforts. So, perhaps, eventually machines will help us in some ways with this, but ultimately I think this is a very human sort of activity, and I'm not sure that I really want a machine to be intervening in my choices.
Thank you very much. If there's anything that I've learned in my year and a half being Director of Research Integrity at Wiley is that my initial first response was tech will solve it. Now my response 18 months later is let's get some people to have a look at some stuff, right? And then maybe we'll use the people to figure out how to design and deliver the technology. But anyway, people first. Brilliant. Thank you all for engaging so wonderfully. Now it's time for closing statements on who looks after integrity and ethics, these essential aspects of quality now. We'll start with you, Elisa. Please offer us your closing thoughts.
Yeah, so my closing thought is that it's great that now we have more choices for peer review model, and we should continue to innovate, and I welcome the author and community-mediated proposals, but I think the editor-mediated one still has an edge, and the edge is the editors. So the fact that we have independent staff that has all the time in the world to engage with their community, come up with standards, in coordination with that community, and act as a sort of independent quality check for the whole of the peer review process, and in that sense they maintain the ethics and integrity of the process.
Thank you. Editor-mediated peer review. Diego, over to you.
So I think we've seen that sort of all the types of peer review that we've talked about have value and sort of are integral in their own way. I would say that yes, the editors do have the edge over having a bunch of time, but in the author-mediated model, I would also say that authors themselves have the edge because they're the ones doing the sort of technical experiments and work in their field, so they know who else is having those same thoughts or conversations, or maybe opposing thoughts or conversations.
Good argument for author-mediated review. And John?
Well, to say this is a prepared statement is a vast exaggeration, believe me, but I think we live in a time of public life where there's a great deal of lack of trust in the scientific process and in scientists as a community, perhaps in scholars as a community generally. And I think we owe it to ourselves to demonstrate and use all the tools that we can find, both machine and human, to make sure that what we are doing is ethically correct, and that we have mechanisms for correcting the record when it turns out that perhaps something was published in error. Then we need to have robust, responsible mechanisms for pointing that out. And if we do that, and as to Fred's point about not just doing it, but telling the public that we do it, then perhaps we can do something to counter the prevailing sense of anti-scholarship or anti-science that is kind of sweeping across too many parts of the globe right now.
Thank you, John. And now my kind of privilege is to add my closing statement, which I don't really need a slide to support, but I've got one. So, what is clear, right, is that our traditional peer-reviewed publishing model is evolving, and it's evolving quite fast, right? There are new models that have emerged. We've heard some of them here, right, that are now coexisting. These new models deliver peer review in slightly different ways, but they are coexisting, and maybe they can knit together to form an ecosystem that's useful. Those new models are supported by new publishing business models. Name check, Judy Versus, Wiley, Deal, Transitional Agreement, we've been talking about quite a lot. Also my conflict of interest there, but I'm thrilled by that announcement. So all of this means that the researcher's world is characterized by complex choices in even the most traditional and conservative things like peer review, right? Peer review is so traditional and so conservative. And so the last words that I'll say is that if we work in the right kinds of way, and yes, that probably does mean collaborating, we can find new kinds of value there for those researchers, and that's where I'll leave it. Thank you all so very much for participating so actively in this last session of the APE conference. Or is it APE, or is it APE? It's APE. But mostly, thank you to our panelists, Elisa, Diego, and John, for giving us a good show.